collecting antiques is more than just a hobby for me. It is a passion, almost an obsession. I have always sought the charm of the past in each piece, the history behind the old objects. And so, when I heard about the auction at the Ashwood Mansion, I knew I couldn't miss it. Ashwood Mansion, an imposing Victorian structure located in a small town on the outskirts of Illinois, was up for auction after the death of its last owner, a collector of rare artifacts. The rumor was that the place was filled with unique items accumulated over decades, and I was eager to explore every corner. On the day of the auction, the atmosphere at the mansion was a mix of anticipation and melancholy. The low sun on the horizon cast long, mysterious shadows over the neglected garden and the house's decaying facade. The autumn winds blew through the trees, carrying a sense that something important was about to be revealed. As I entered the mansion, I was immediately enveloped by the smell of aged wood and dust. Each room was filled with antiquated furniture, faded portraits, and forgotten objects. I was immersed in the search for an item that would catch my attention when I finally reached a room that seemed to have been used as a storage space for toys and children's items. There, in a dark and poorly lit corner, they were, a set of porcelain dolls. What caught my attention were the meticulous details, the velvet dresses, the silk bows, and the glass eyes that seemed to follow every movement. These dolls had an antique look, from a time when every detail was carefully crafted. There was something unsettling about them, something that stirred a certain discomfort, but also an irresistible fascination. Each doll was different, but they all had a charm that seemed almost supernatural. One wore a blue dress with lace and a small flower on her hat. Another had a pink ruffled dress, and a third wore a period costume that resembled a figure from a fairy tale. Despite their aesthetic appeal, their expressions were melancholic, as if they carried an untold story. While examining these dolls, an elderly woman, who seemed to be the curator of the items, approached me and told me that the dolls had belonged to a family who lived in the mansion many years ago. According to her, they were gifts from a father to his sick daughter, a girl who had tragically died in her childhood. The stories about the family and the fate of the dolls only increased my interest. It was as if the dolls were not just old objects but silent witnesses to a dark past. At the auction, the dolls attracted the attention of several collectors, but I was determined to have them. When the auctioneer's hammer fell, I had acquired the dolls. They were carefully packed and delivered to me, and I felt a mix of satisfaction and unease as I brought them home. As soon as the dolls were placed in my living room, a strange feeling enveloped me. I looked at them, and although part of me was enchanted by the new addition to my collection, another part could not ignore the premonition that something was about to change. Upon leaving the mansion, a cold sensation ran down my spine, as if the past had left a mark on me. That night, while the house was wrapped in deep silence, I couldn't help but wonder if the dolls, with all their dark history, were really ready to integrate into my home. In the first few days after the dolls' arrival, life in my house seemed to follow its normal course. However, something subtle and disturbing began to happen. Small glitches and anomalies started to manifest, and I initially tried to ignore them, attributing them to coincidences or my own imagination. The first sign of something out of the ordinary came in the form of an old wall clock, a precious item I had inherited from my grandparents. It had worked perfectly until the dolls arrived, but now it was frozen, the second hand marking a fixed point, ignoring the rhythm of time. At first, I thought it was just a mechanical failure, perhaps an issue with the internal mechanism. However, after attempting to fix it and discovering that the problem was not easily resolved, I began to question if there was more at play. Then, problems with the food started. The refrigerator, which used to keep food fresh for weeks, was strangely failing. Fruits and vegetables, which would normally last much longer, began to deteriorate within days. Milk, which should have been consumed in a week, was sour within days. These problems were not limited to perishable items. Even canned and dried foods seemed to suffer alterations, with some showing signs of spoilage sooner than expected. This inexplicable phenomenon left me perplexed, especially since the appliance was functioning perfectly and there was no clear reason for such failures. As these events became more frequent, I began to notice something more disturbing: inexplicable sounds. It was as if the house had begun to take on a life of its own. I heard soft, almost inaudible footsteps in the hallways, especially at night. It was a subtle but distinct sound, similar to someone walking with light, careful steps. At first, I attributed these sounds to animals outside or water pipes expanding and contracting with temperature changes. But as the footsteps became more frequent, there was no reasonable explanation for them. One night, while sitting in my upstairs office, I heard a sound that seemed to come from the room where the dolls were displayed. It was a low, continuous whisper, like a conversation at a very low volume. Initially, I thought it could be a neighbor's television or some kind of sound interference. However, the sound seemed to be coming directly from inside the house, and there was no obvious source for it. When I went to investigate, the room was silent and dark, with only the dolls in their usual positions. The discomfort began to grow. The dolls, which I had once seen as a charming addition to my collection, now seemed to have a disturbing presence. Their glass eyes seemed to follow my movements, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were always watching. On some occasions, I noticed that they had changed positions without me touching them. The movements were not drastic, but subtle, as if the dolls were trying to adjust to observe me better. My mind began to race, trying to find rational explanations for all these events. Was there a logical explanation for the clock and refrigerator failures? And what about the footsteps and whispers? I became obsessed with finding an answer, but rational explanations began to fail. Instead, I started to question whether something more supernatural was at play, something I couldn't fully comprehend. The events began to escalate, and the growing discomfort in my house no longer made sense. Each small incident seemed to be connected to something larger, something beyond my understanding. The dolls, which had arrived as simple collectibles, were now at the center of a disturbing and unsettling mystery. The nights in my house began to turn into increasingly disturbing experiences. What was once a peaceful and comfortable home was now becoming a scene of unrest and anxiety. Each night seemed to bring a new sense of strangeness and discomfort, and I found myself increasingly disturbed by what was happening. Shortly after the dolls arrived, my nights began to be interrupted by a sense of unease that I couldn't explain. The first sign was a slight chill that seemed to seep into my room. I checked the windows and doors, but everything was in order. The temperature in the rest of the house remained normal, but in my room, a chilly sensation persisted, as if a cold draft was constantly present. As I lay down, I tried to push these thoughts away and focus on sleep, but the silence of the house seemed to carry a palpable tension. The shadows cast by the swaying trees outside seemed to move strangely, creating unsettling patterns on the walls of my room. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was in the living room, watching me. Although nothing visible was out of place, the feeling of presence was inescapable. The worst was when the sounds started. Initially, they were subtle footsteps, almost imperceptible, as if someone was walking deliberately and silently through the hallways. I heard these footsteps mostly downstairs, where the dolls were displayed. They were light but consistent steps that seemed to follow a pattern. Often, I would go down to investigate, but I found only silence and emptiness. The feeling that something was indeed moving inside the house was confirmed on a particularly unsettling night. I was trying to sleep when a light, rhythmic sound, similar to a tambourine, began to manifest. It seemed as if someone was lightly tapping on a drum. The sound was constant and followed an irregular pattern, increasing in intensity and decreasing, as if trying to get my attention. I turned on the light and searched the house but found nothing that could explain the sound. This sense of presence intensified to the point of affecting my sanity. One night, after another series of footsteps and whispers, I decided to record the sounds. I placed a recorder downstairs, and when I listened to the recording the next day, I heard something that left me paralyzed with fear. There were indistinct whispers and a light breathing that couldn't have been mine. The most disturbing was the sound of a faint, almost inaudible voice saying, "I'm not ready." The discomfort of being alone at home became a constant. I tried several times to explain these experiences logically, believing that I might be imagining things due to stress or my own suggestion. But the frequency and persistence of these events defied any rational explanation. Every night, the atmosphere in the house seemed to grow heavier, and the weight of unease became almost unbearable. The feeling of being watched and the fear of something I couldn't see became a constant in my life. I tried to focus on other activities during the day to avoid thinking about the disturbing nights. But the sense of dread persisted. Every sound, every shadow seemed to carry a hidden meaning, and the house, which had once been a tranquil refuge, now became a place of constant terror. Dreams also began to be affected. I had frequent nightmares, always involving the dolls. They appeared in my dreams, moving slowly and sinisterly, their glass eyes fixed on me as if trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. These dreams were so vivid that when I woke up, I felt an almost physical fear, a sense that something was about to happen. As time passed, the nights became a battlefield between the need to sleep and the constant fear of what might happen. I found myself in a spiral of anxiety and exhaustion, struggling to maintain sanity while the sense of terror intensified. The house, once a refuge, now seemed to be a labyrinth of nightmares. The growing discomfort in my house and the inexplicable phenomena led me to an obsessive search for answers. I needed to understand the origin of the dolls and whether there was a connection between them and the disturbing events that were happening. The feeling of being watched and the growing fear drove me to investigate deeply the history behind these unsettling objects. I began my research with a methodical approach. First, I contacted antique experts and local historians. Some were skeptical about the idea that the dolls could be causing paranormal phenomena, but they were willing to help with information about their origin. I also combed through historical records and old newspaper articles in local libraries, hoping to find some clue. It was during a visit to the Ashwood Town Archive that I found a record of an old family who had lived in the mansion almost a century ago. The Duval family had been one of the most prominent in the region during the 1920s. There were several documents about Mr. Jonathan Duval, a successful businessman, and his wife, Margaret. However, what really caught my attention was a section about the couple's daughter, Eliza, a child who had tragically died in 1927 at the age of 7. Eliza Duval's story was particularly moving. She had suffered from typhoid fever, a disease that had no effective treatment at the time. The Duval family did everything possible to comfort the girl during her illness, and the records indicated that, in an effort to cheer her up, Jonathan Duval commissioned a set of porcelain dolls, made to order for his daughter. The dolls were described as consolation gifts, intended to be companions for Eliza during her long and painful illness. There were also records that Eliza died shortly after receiving the dolls, and the family's grief was immense. Jonathan Duval was described as devastated by his daughter's death, and the dolls were left behind in the mansion when the family moved away, unable to continue living in the place that had brought them so much sadness. With this information, I was led to reflect on the deeper meaning of the dolls. They were not just old objects, they were symbols of inconsolable mourning and a desperate attempt to offer comfort. This understanding brought a new perspective on the events occurring in my house. The dolls seemed to carry not just the weight of history but also a kind of emotional residue, an unresolved sadness that now manifested in my life. I then decided to dig deeper and searched for the descendants of the Duval family. There were records that some family members still resided in the Illinois area. I found a distant relative, an elderly lady named Helen Duval, who seemed to be the only direct descendant of the original family. I contacted her, and after an initial conversation, I explained the situation and the connection of the dolls to her family. Helen was curious, and upon hearing about the disturbing events that had occurred since the dolls arrived, she showed genuine concern. Helen agreed to meet with me. When she arrived at my house, the atmosphere was charged with palpable tension. She examined the dolls with a look of deep melancholy and immediately recognized Eliza's characteristic features in their expressions and details. Helen told me that, even after all these years, the stories about Eliza and her loss were still very vivid in the family's memory. She became emotional as she talked about the lost daughter and said that the dolls were gifts of love and sorrow. Understanding the emotional weight these dolls carried, Helen suggested that the best solution would be to return the dolls to the Duval family. According to her, this could help find some kind of peace for Eliza's soul and also allow the family to close a painful chapter of their history. The idea of returning the dolls seemed to be the only way to resolve the situation and, at the same time, respect Eliza's memory. The relief and understanding I felt hearing Helen's perspective were almost palpable. The sense that there was a deeper and more personal explanation for the disturbing events helped me face the fear that had consumed my life. Although there was a sense of loss in considering the idea of parting with the dolls, I knew it was the necessary step to restore peace and balance in my home. As the days passed and the feeling of discomfort became a constant in my life, the phenomena in my house began to escalate in ways I could no longer ignore. What had once been minor inconveniences turned into a series of inexplicable and disturbing events that seemed to defy any logical explanation. The first sign that the situation was intensifying was the sudden change in temperature inside the house. On a particularly cold night, the temperature in my living room dropped drastically, despite the thermostat showing that the heating system was working normally. It was a piercing cold that seemed to penetrate the bones, and no matter how much I tried to warm the room, the cold persisted. I checked the heating system and wiring, but everything was in order. The sensation of cold was so intense that it felt like something or someone was trying to manifest. In addition to the cold, the house lights began to behave strangely. Lights that had previously been stable started flickering randomly, as if an invisible interference was affecting the electricity. Sometimes, the lights flickered irregularly, alternating between high and low intensity, and on some occasions, they would go out completely before turning back on with unusual intensity. The house's electrical system had been inspected recently, and electricians assured me everything was working correctly. However, the erratic behavior of the lights continued, creating an atmosphere of tension and discomfort. The pattern of footsteps and whispers became more pronounced and intrusive. The footsteps that had once been discreet and light were now more audible and seemed to follow a more defined pattern. I heard these footsteps frequently at night, but they also started occurring during the day. Sometimes, I heard the sound of something dragging through the hallways, like someone dragging a chair or a box. The feeling that there was someone moving inside the house became almost constant, and the unease grew with each new sound. One of the most disturbing experiences occurred while I was in the kitchen, trying to prepare a snack at night. While I was focused on the task, I heard a loud noise coming from the living room. I ran to check and found one of the dolls fallen on the floor, its head turned to the side. There was no logical explanation for the fall, as the doll had been positioned on a firm stand, and there was no draft that could have knocked it over. This seemingly trivial incident contributed to the growing feeling of discomfort. In addition to the sounds and the cold, I began to notice a sense of presence that seemed to accompany my shadow at all times. It was as if something invisible was constantly near me, watching my movements and creating a feeling of vigilance. In moments of solitude, this feeling intensified, and I felt as if I was being followed or watched. This sense of presence was not just a passing impression. It was a constant feeling that something was there, waiting to reveal itself. The events reached a climax when I began to notice the dolls moving on their own. Initially, it was just a slight sense that they had shifted positions, but over time, the movements became more evident and unsettling. I would leave the dolls in a specific place, and upon returning, I would find them in different positions, often facing me directly as if they were watching me. These changes were not just minor. Sometimes, the dolls were displaced in ways that seemed almost impossible, as if they were trying to adjust to a new angle of view. To confirm my suspicions, I began taking photos of the dolls regularly to document any changes. In several of these photos, The dolls seemed to have different positions and expressions from what I remembered. The photos captured subtle details, such as the angles of the faces and the orientation of the eyes, which seemed to change without explanation. Documenting the events only heightened my unease and made me question the reality of the experiences I was having. The feeling of being watched and the sense of an invisible presence became a constant part of my life. The house, which had once been a safe place, was now a battlefield where I fought to maintain sanity and security. Every noise, every change in the atmosphere seemed to be connected to something deeper and more disturbing, something I couldn't fully comprehend. My mind was constantly occupied trying to find a rational explanation for what was happening. I considered all possibilities, from structural problems in the house to inexplicable natural phenomena. However, rational explanations began to fade, and the only conclusion I could reach was that something much more sinister was at play. The escalation of disturbing events reached a point where I could no longer ignore the need to confront the situation directly. The discomfort and fear became so oppressive that I knew I needed to act rather than wait for things to get even worse. The weight of tension and the constant feeling of being watched reached a critical point, and I needed to find a way to confront whatever was disturbing my home. On a particularly distressing night, after hearing the incessant footsteps and muffled whispers, I decided to face the problem head-on. The idea was simple but terrifying. Sit in the room where the dolls were and confront the situation directly, trying to understand what was happening and what might be causing all these phenomena. I prepared the room for my confrontation session. I turned off all the lights except for a small table lamp that cast a faint, diffuse light, creating a somber and intimidating environment. I placed a chair in the center of the room, facing the dolls, and sat down, determined to face whatever was happening. I placed an audio recorder on the table, hoping to capture any sound that might provide clues about the source of the events. I spoke aloud, trying to remain calm despite the fear consuming me. I asked aloud what was happening, what the dolls wanted, and why they were disturbing my life. The air in the room seemed thick, charged with an energy I couldn't identify. I hoped for a clear response, something that could explain the phenomena and give me a direction to follow. As I spoke, the environment around me seemed to become even more charged. The feeling of cold intensified, and the silence was broken only by the noises from the recorder. I watched the dolls, trying to interpret any movement or change. The tension was palpable, and I could feel my heart racing with every creak and every whisper that seemed to come from the house itself. The emotional atmosphere in the room became almost unbearable. The feeling of being watched grew even more, and I began to feel an invisible presence around me, as if something was next to me, just out of my field of vision. With each passing minute, the fear became more intense, and I wondered if I could really face whatever was tormenting me. Then, in a moment of absolute silence, I heard something that made me shudder. A faint, almost inaudible voice whispered, "I'm cold." The voice seemed to be a mix of sadness and despair, and the message was clear enough to have a profound impact on me. It was a moment of painful revelation, suggesting that the source of the disturbing events was not a malevolent entity but rather a lost soul seeking comfort and understanding. I realized that the disturbing presence might not be hostile, but rather a reflection of Eliza's unresolved suffering. The idea that the girl who had been left behind, along with the dolls that were given to her, was now trying to communicate and seek help deeply moved me. What I was facing was not necessarily an attack, but a manifestation of pain and sorrow. To deal with this revelation, I decided that the best approach would be to try to bring closure to the situation, respecting Eliza's memory and offering some kind of comfort. Based on the conversation with Helen Duval and my own understanding, I began planning to return the dolls to the Duval family. This decision seemed to be the most appropriate way to restore peace and provide some resolution for Eliza's troubled soul. I also decided to make one last check of the audio recorder to see if there was anything else recorded. When listening to the recording, in addition to the whisper I had heard live, I noticed other subtle sounds that seemed related to Eliza's presence. The recorder captured the sound of light breathing and a murmur of sadness, reinforcing the idea that the source of the events was not malevolent but rather an expression of unresolved suffering. With these discoveries and the plan to return the dolls, I began to feel a sense of relief. Confronting what was disturbing my life had provided me with a new perspective. Accepting that the situation was a manifestation of pain rather than malevolence helped me face the fear and anxiety that had dominated my life. Finally, the time came to put into practice the plan I had devised, returning the dolls to the Duval family. The idea of handing over these relics, which had brought so much discomfort and uncertainty, was a task that filled me with anxiety but also hope. The hope that by returning the dolls, I could provide relief not only for myself but also for Eliza's troubled soul. The meeting with Helen Duval was marked by a mix of expectation and apprehension. She seemed to understand the importance of returning the dolls and was willing to receive the relics with the same reverence I had felt when investigating them. I carefully prepared the dolls for transport, ensuring they were well packaged and protected, respecting their fragility and the emotional significance they carried. On the morning of the meeting, I loaded the boxes containing the dolls into the car and drove to Helen's house, located in a quiet suburb of Illinois. The journey there was filled with a sense of closure, as if I was about to close an important chapter of my life. As I drove, I reflected on the events that had occurred and the impact that returning the dolls would have on my life and on Helen's life. When I arrived at Helen's house, I was greeted with a warm hug and an understanding look. She led me to a room that had been prepared to receive the dolls. The room was decorated with old photos and memorabilia from the Duval family, and the atmosphere was one of respect and nostalgia. Helen thanked me for taking care of the dolls and for making an effort to understand the story behind them. I carefully placed the boxes in the center of the room and began unwrapping the dolls one by one. As I did so, Helen watched with a mix of curiosity and emotion. With each doll I unwrapped, she examined the details with attention, as if reconnecting with an important piece of her own family history. When the last doll was revealed, Helen approached with a look of recognition and affection. She gently caressed the porcelain, demonstrating deep respect. It was clear that the dolls had a very special meaning for her and her family. Helen explained that after Eliza's death, the dolls had been stored in a trunk, and the trunk had never been reopened until that moment. Returning the dolls represented an emotional closure that the Duval family had been seeking for so long. The act of returning the dolls was marked by a discreet and respectful ceremony. Helen organized a small ceremony in which the dolls were placed on an improvised altar, surrounded by candles and flowers. She offered a silent prayer, which seemed to be a form of reconciliation with the past pain and a way to give peace to Eliza. The atmosphere was charged with solemn calm, and I felt a deep sense of relief seeing the Duval family finding some kind of resolution. After the ceremony, Helen and I talked about the experiences we had both lived through. She shared stories about Eliza and the impact her loss had on the family. We talked about how the past can leave invisible marks, but when approached with understanding and empathy, they can find a way to heal. This conversation was a turning point for me, helping me understand that unresolved pain can manifest in unexpected ways, but it can also be addressed with respect and compassion. When I left Helen's house, I felt a sense of lightness and renewal. Returning the dolls not only brought closure to the disturbing story, but also provided a new perspective on how to deal with the past and the emotional traces it can leave. The feeling of being free from the burden I had carried for so long was comforting and gave me a fresh start. Back at my house, I noticed that the atmosphere was different. The tension and discomfort that had been a constant for weeks seemed to have diminished. The lights no longer flickered, and the footsteps and whispers had ceased. The house seemed to have regained its tranquility, and I felt free to start anew. The impact of the events was present in my mind, but the resolution and closure allowed me to find peace and move forward with a new understanding of what had happened. The episode with the dolls became a valuable lesson about the importance of facing the unknown with courage and empathy. The experience taught me the importance of seeking understanding and finding ways to deal with the past, respecting the memories and pain it may carry. Returning the dolls and meeting the Duval family were the final steps to restoring peace in my life, and I was ready to embrace a future free from the shadow of disturbing events. If you enjoyed this true horror story, you can't miss the story of writer Alex Carter. In search of inspiration, he moves to Redwood, an isolated town in northern Maine, shrouded in mysteries and ancient legends. When he finds an old diary in his attic, Alex uncovers tales of shadows that move on their own and voices in the forest. His curiosity drives him to investigate the abandoned house of a sinister character, where he discovers occult rituals and a dark pact threatening to unveil terrifying secrets. Each new discovery deepens the mystery and increases the danger as Alex becomes entangled in a cycle of supernatural events that test his courage and sanity. What truly lurks in Redwood's shadows? Can Alex escape the horrors he has awakened? To uncover this mystery, watch the video here on the card or look for the previous video on this channel. And of course, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments if you've had a paranormal experience as well. Stay brave, and see you in the next macabre story.